The luxury charity gala on the mountain peak was filled with the ultra-rich. A sleek, modern helicopter sat on the helipad, ready for scenic tours. Near the landing pad, a powerful female CEO laughed with her wealthy friends. She noticed a man in faded jeans, repairing a wooden fence nearby. He was staring at the aircraft. Amused, she raised her glass and called out, "If you can actually fly that helicopter, I will marry you." The crowd erupted in laughter. The man simply smiled. Then, the pilot suddenly collapsed from a massive heart attack. "Does anyone know how to fly?" The quiet fence repairman slowly stood up. Michael Carter was 44 years old, but his face had the weathered look of a man who had fought too many battles against the wind. He wore a pair of dirty denim jeans, scuffed work boots, and a simple plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hands were calloused, dry, and covered in splinters from the rough pine fencing he was installing. To the billionaires attending the mountaintop gala, he was just part of the scenery. A low-wage maintenance worker hired to keep the luxury resort looking pristine. But Michael was a man of secrets. 10 years ago, he wasn't repairing fences. He was Major Michael Carter, a legendary rescue pilot for the United States military. He had flown twin-engine helicopters through blinding blizzards, active combat zones, and treacherous mountain valleys. He had saved over 100 lives. But his final mission changed everything. During a violent storm in the Alaskan wilderness, a sudden downdraft slammed his helicopter into a ridge. Michael survived, but his co-pilot, his best friend, David, did not. The guilt was a heavy, suffocating weight. Michael hung up his flight suit, walked away from the aviation world, and promised himself he would never touch the controls of an aircraft again. He retreated to this quiet mountain resort, taking a humble job as a maintenance technician. He wanted peace. He wanted to keep his feet firmly on the ground. Most of all, he wanted to be there for his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. Sophie was a bright, imaginative girl with wild brown curls and her father's quiet resilience. But Sophie's life was not easy. She suffered from a severe, chronic lung condition that made breathing difficult during the cold mountain winters. Michael lived in a small, cozy cabin on the edge of the resort property, dedicating every spare second of his life to her. On this particular afternoon, Sophie had walked up from their cabin to bring her father a metal tin filled with homemade chicken soup. She sat on a nearby rock, swinging her legs, watching her dad work. In her small hands, she clutched a wooden helicopter that Michael had hand-carved for her. Just 50 yards away, the luxury charity event was in full swing. Evelyn Brooks, the 39-year-old founder and CEO of Brooks Tech Industries, stood at the center of a wealthy circle. Evelyn was exceptionally beautiful, dressed in a tailored emerald green pantsuit that screamed authority. She was a self-made billionaire, famous for her sharp wit and her ruthless efficiency in the boardroom. But behind her brilliant smile lay a profound, aching loneliness. Evelyn used humor and sarcasm as armor. She kept everyone at a distance. As Evelyn chatted with her friends, her eyes drifted to Michael. He was sweating, wiping his forehead with a dirty rag, his eyes fixed on the sleek Eurocopter parked on the asphalt pad. One of Evelyn's snobbish friends, a venture capitalist named Julian, sneered, "Look at that guy. He's staring at the chopper like it's a spaceship. He probably couldn't even afford the fuel for a 5-minute ride." The group chuckled. Evelyn, wanting to maintain her reputation for sharp, playful humor, raised her glass of champagne toward Michael. "Hey, mechanic," Evelyn called out, her voice carrying across the mountain breeze. "If you can actually fly that helicopter, I will marry you." Her friends roared with laughter. They waited for the worker to look embarrassed, to scramble away in shame. But Michael didn't flinch. He slowly stood up to his full height, his military posture naturally taking over. He looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips. "I hope you don't have to keep your word, ma'am," Michael replied, his voice deep and calm. Evelyn felt a strange, sudden flutter in her chest. There was no fear in his eyes. No insecurity. Just a quiet, immovable dignity. She quickly looked away, taking a sip of her champagne to hide her sudden nervousness. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, pulling on Michael's sleeve. "Why is that lady being mean to you?" Michael knelt down, gently bopping Sophie on the nose. "She's not being mean, sweetheart. She's just playing a game. Sometimes, people who have everything on the outside are just trying to find a way to smile on the inside." Sophie nodded, looking at her wooden toy. "But you really can fly, Daddy. You used to be a hero." "That was a long time ago, Sophie," Michael said softly, his eyes darkening with memory. "Now, my only job is being your dad." But the mountains have a way of changing plans, and the sky was about to call him back. The afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, dramatic shadows across the resort. The wind was picking up, whispering warnings through the pine trees. Inside the glass-walled pavilion, the wealthy guests were enjoying dessert. Suddenly, a panicked commotion broke out near the outdoor terrace. "Help! We need a doctor! Right now!" Evelyn Brooks rushed toward the noise. One of the high-profile donors, an older man named Charles, had collapsed onto a lounge chair. His face was swollen, his skin turning a terrifying shade of blue. He was clutching his throat, gasping for air. "It's an allergic reaction," someone screamed. "He ate something with peanuts. He's going into anaphylactic shock." Charles's wife was in tears, searching her purse frantically. "His EpiPen. It's empty. Oh my God. He can't breathe." The resort manager ran over, his face pale. "I've called the paramedics, but because of the remote location and the winding mountain roads, the ambulance will take at least 45 minutes to get up here." 45 minutes. Charles didn't have 10. His throat was closing. "The helicopter," Evelyn yelled, pointing to the helipad. "Fly him down to the Valley Hospital. It's only a 6-minute flight." The manager shook his head in despair. "The pilot, he's not here." He walked down to the staff lodge to eat. "We are trying to radio him, but there's no signal in the ravine." Panic spread like wildfire. The wealthy guests, accustomed to solving every problem with a checkbook, stood absolutely helpless. Their money could not buy oxygen. Their status could not make an ambulance move faster. Just then, Michael Carter walked through the crowd. He had heard the screams. He took one look at Charles's blue lips and swollen face, and his military rescue training instantly kicked in. "He needs to be evacuated immediately," Michael said, his voice cutting through the hysterical chatter. "His airway is about to close completely. We don't have a pilot." Julian, Evelyn's friend, yelled in frustration. "What are we supposed to do? Watch him die?" Michael took a deep breath. The memory of the Alaskan crash flashed in his mind. The sound of metal twisting, the smell of burning fuel. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands began to shake. He had promised himself he would never fly again. But then he looked at Charles's terrified wife. He looked at Sophie, who was standing near the edge of the crowd, watching him with wide, trusting eyes. "You can do it, Daddy." Her small voice seemed to echo in his mind. Michael looked at Evelyn. "I can fly," Michael said simply. The crowd went dead silent. Evelyn stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "You? What are you talking about? You're a maintenance guy." "There's no time to argue," Michael barked, his voice suddenly carrying the heavy, unquestionable authority of a military officer. "Get him into the back seat of the helicopter. Now!" Before anyone could protest, Michael ran toward the helipad. Evelyn, driven by a mixture of disbelief and a strange sense of responsibility, followed him. She helped Charles's wife support the dying man as they hurried toward the aircraft. Michael climbed into the pilot's seat. He grabbed the flight helmet, slipping it over his ears. His hands hovered over the instrument panel. For 3 seconds, he froze. The dashboard lights looked like a ghost from his past. "Focus, Carter," he told himself. "A life is on the line." His fingers moved with rapid, flawless muscle memory. He flipped the master switch. The turbine engine let out a low, rising whine. The massive rotor blades began to turn, slicing through the thin mountain air. Evelyn stood outside the cabin, her hair whipping violently in the rotor wash. She looked through the glass. The man in the dusty jeans was gone. In his place was a focused, cold-eyed commander. He looked down at her. He didn't say a word. He simply engaged the collective. The helicopter lifted off the ground with perfect, fluid grace. It tilted forward, diving over the edge of the cliff and soaring down into the valley below. Evelyn watched until the red tail light disappeared into the darkening sky. Her jaw was slack. Her heart was racing. He actually did it, Julian whispered behind her, his voice filled with a sudden, humiliating awe. 2 hours later, the helicopter returned. The night had fully fallen, the helipad illuminated by bright floodlights. The aircraft touched down gently, as light as a feather. Michael cut the engine. The rotors slowed to a stop. As Michael stepped out of the cockpit, the remaining guests at the resort gathered around. But Michael didn't want their applause. He walked straight past them, looking for his daughter. Evelyn stepped into his path. She had changed out of her emerald suit. She looked smaller, humbled. "The hospital called the resort," Evelyn said, her voice shaking slightly. "They said Charles made it just in time. Another 2 minutes, and his heart would have stopped. You saved him, Michael." Michael wiped his face with his sleeve. "I just did what needed to be done, Ms. Brooks." Evelyn looked down at her hands, her cheeks flushing. I want to apologize for what I said earlier. It was incredibly disrespectful. I judged you based on my clothes." Michael offered a gentle, tired smile. "It's okay. Most people only see what they want to see. But the sky doesn't care about your net worth, Ms. Brooks. It treats everyone the same." He walked past her, picking up Sophie, who had run into his arms. Evelyn watched him go. For the first time in her life, she felt completely insignificant. And for the first time, she wanted to know more about a man who owned absolutely nothing, yet carried himself like a king. Over the next 2 weeks, the high society world of the resort was buzzing. Journalists had tried to contact the hero maintenance man, but Michael refused every interview. He didn't want fame. He just wanted to paint the resort's lakeside cabins before the first frost. But Evelyn Brooks did not leave the resort. Her assistant was furious. Brooks Tech Industries had a major merger on the horizon. But Evelyn kept delaying her return flight to Silicon Valley. She found herself walking the resort trails, hoping to run into the quiet pilot. One afternoon, she found him by the lake, teaching Sophie how to skim stones across the glassy water. "Room for one more?" Evelyn asked, stepping onto the gravel beach. She was wearing casual hiking boots and a simple sweater. The sharp, intimidating CEO looked remarkably human. Michael looked up, surprised. "Ms. Brooks, I figured you'd be back in your high-rise by now." "Call me Evelyn," she said, picking up a flat stone. She threw it. It sank immediately with a loud plop. Sophie giggled. "You have to flick your wrist, Evelyn. Like this." Sophie threw a stone. It skipped 3 times. Evelyn laughed, a genuine, relaxed sound that she hadn't made in years. "All right, teacher. Show me again." For the next hour, the billionaire CEO and the maintenance man's daughter laughed like old friends. Michael watched them, a warm feeling blooming in his chest. He saw how gentle Evelyn was with Sophie. He saw the loneliness in her eyes melt away when Sophie held her hand. Later, as Sophie played near the shoreline, Evelyn sat next to Michael on a fallen log. "Why did you stop flying, Michael?" she asked softly. "The manager told me you were in the military. You're a prodigy up there. Why are you repairing fences?" Michael stared at the water. The silence stretched for so long Evelyn thought he wouldn't answer. "I lost my best friend," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. "We crashed in Alaska. I survived. He didn't. Every time I look at an instrument panel, I hear the alarms. I see his face. It's a ghost I couldn't outrun." Evelyn's heart ached. She reached out, her fingers gently touching his calloused hand. "I know what it's like to live with ghosts," Evelyn said quietly. Michael turned his head to look at her. My mother died 6 years ago, Evelyn continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She was in the hospital calling me, but I was in the middle of a critical board meeting. We were closing a $50 million acquisition. I turned my phone off. By the time I arrived at the hospital, she was gone. I never got to say goodbye. She let out a shaky breath. I built a tech empire to try and drown out the guilt. I thought if I became successful enough, the pain would stop. But the rooms just got bigger and emptier. Michael squeezed her hand. We can't rewrite the past, Evelyn. We can only choose how we live in the present. You're not a bad person. You were just flying too high to see the ground. It was a profound moment of connection. Two broken souls, finding a rare moment of peace on a quiet lake shore. But the peace was shattered 2 days later. Jonathan Reed, Evelyn's ex-fiancé and a powerful venture capitalist, arrived at the resort. He was a tall, handsome man with a perfectly tailored suit and an air of absolute superiority. He had flown in on his private jet to force Evelyn back to the city. He found Evelyn having coffee with Michael at the resort's outdoor cafe. Jonathan walked over, a smirk on his face. Evelyn, darling, I heard you were playing house with the local staff. But the board is waiting. We have a merger to sign. He looked at Michael, his eyes scanning Michael's paint-splattered work clothes with disgust. Is this the fence fixer I've been hearing about? Jonathan sneered. Tell me, buddy, do you always use rescue missions to get close to wealthy women? Evelyn stood up, her eyes flashing with a dangerous anger. Jonathan, shut up. You know nothing about him. I know he's a nobody, Evelyn. Jonathan snapped. He's a charity case. He lives in a shack. He's not in our league. Come on, let's go. Before Evelyn could reply, Sophie ran toward the table. She was gasping for air, her face turning pale. Daddy! Sophie wheezed, clutching her chest. My chest. It hurts. I can't breathe. Michael's instincts flared. He caught her as her legs gave out. Sophie, look at me. Breathe, baby. Breathe. Her inhaler wasn't working. The high altitude and the sudden cold front had triggered a severe pulmonary spasm. We need to get her to the clinic, Michael said, his voice tight with panic. I'll drive you, Evelyn said immediately. Don't be ridiculous, Evelyn, Jonathan scoffed. Let the resort staff handle it. We have a flight to catch. Evelyn turned to Jonathan, her voice cold as ice. If you ever speak to me again, Jonathan, I will destroy your fund. We are done. She turned her back on him, running alongside Michael as he carried Sophie to her SUV. At the Valley Hospital, Sophie was quickly admitted to the pediatric unit. She was placed on oxygen and given intravenous medication. Michael sat by her bed, holding her small hand, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. The doctor stepped out of the room, motioning for Michael and Evelyn to follow. She's stable for now, the doctor said, but her lung tissue is severely scarred from her chronic condition. She needs a highly specialized treatment program. There's a pediatric pulmonary clinic in Seattle that can perform a series of advanced laser therapies. It has a 90% success rate. Michael's heart leaped. Then let's do it. When can we start? The doctor hesitated. The treatment is highly specialized, Mr. Carter. It's not covered by standard insurance. The full course of therapy costs $85,000, and they require a deposit before they will even schedule the first session. $85,000. To Michael, it might as well have been $85 million. His savings had been wiped out by Sophie's previous hospital stays. He felt a familiar, crushing despair settling over his chest. Evelyn stepped forward, pulling a sleek black checkbook from her purse. I'll write the check right now. Write it for the full amount. Michael's hand shot out, gently but firmly stopping her pen. No, Evelyn, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. Evelyn looked at him, confused. Michael, this is your daughter's life. Don't let your pride do this. It's not pride, Evelyn, Michael said softly, looking into her eyes. It's dignity. If I take your money, our friendship changes. I become a beggar, and you become my savior. I don't want your pity. I need to look my daughter in the eyes and know that I provided for her. I need an opportunity to earn my way, not a handout." Evelyn stared at him. She saw the absolute, unbreakable resolve in his eyes. She realized that Michael's dignity was his most valuable possession. To strip him of that would be to destroy the very man she had come to admire. She slowly put her checkbook away. "Okay," Evelyn whispered. "We will find another way. I promise you." Evelyn Brooks did not sleep that night. She sat in her luxury cabin, staring at her laptop screen. She realized that if she wanted to help Michael, she had to respect his values. She couldn't just throw money at his problems. She had to offer him a bridge, not a parachute. She spent hours researching, calling her corporate partners, and looking through the Brooks Tech philanthropic portfolio. The next morning, she walked down to the small hospital waiting room. Michael was asleep in a plastic chair, his head resting against the wall. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes deep and heavy. Evelyn gently tapped his shoulder. Michael blinked, sitting up. "Evelyn? What are you doing here? You should be asleep." "I have a proposition for you, Major Carter," Evelyn said, a soft, professional smile on her face. She handed him a folder of documents. Michael opened it. Inside was a contract for a position called Director of Aeromedical Logistics for the Brooks Foundation. "What is this?" Michael asked, scanning the pages. "My company has a charitable foundation," Evelyn explained, sitting next to him. "We are launching a new initiative to provide rapid medical drone and helicopter transport for emergency supplies in remote mountainous regions. We have the technology and we have the funding, but we don't have anyone who knows how to operate in extreme weather conditions." She looked into his eyes, her voice filled with sincere respect. "I need an elite pilot, Michael. I need someone who can train our crews, design our flight paths, and lead the emergency response team. The salary is $120,000 a year. It includes comprehensive executive health insurance that covers all dependents. And the job is based in Seattle, right next to the pulmonary clinic." Michael's hands began to shake as he held the paper. "Evelyn, this is not a handout, Michael," she interrupted gently. "You are quite literally the only man qualified for this job. You've flown thousands of hours in the worst conditions imaginable. You will be saving lives, and you will be earning every single penny." Michael looked at the contract. He looked at the signature line. For years, he had been hiding in the mountains, afraid of the sky, afraid of his own past. But now, the sky was offering him a way to save his daughter. "I'll do it," Michael said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you, Evelyn." Evelyn smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, Michael, for letting me be a part of your story." 3 months passed. The transition to Seattle was a whirlwind. Sophie's treatment at the pulmonary clinic went flawlessly. The advanced laser therapy cleared the deep scarring in her lung tissue, allowing her to breathe deeply and without pain for the first time in her life. Michael loved his new role at the foundation. He was back in the aviation world, but this time he was using his scars to protect others. He spent his days in a state-of-the-art office, overseeing flight safety protocols and mentoring young pilots. But the biggest change was in Evelyn. She had officially stepped down as the active CEO of Brooks Tech, taking a role as the chairperson of the board. She delegated her daily tasks, working only 30 hours a week. She bought a small, beautiful house near the Seattle waterfront. One crisp autumn Saturday, Evelyn walked into Michael's new apartment. The room was filled with the warm, sweet smell of baking cookies. Sophie was kneeling on the carpet, painting a brand new wooden helicopter model. This one was larger, painted in bright blue and gold, the colors of the Brooks Foundation. "Evelyn," Sophie squealed, running over and throwing her arms around Evelyn's waist. Evelyn hugged her back tightly, burying her face in Sophie's soft curls. Suatia. "Look at those rosy cheeks. You look amazing. I can run all the way to the park now without stopping," Sophie said proudly. "And Daddy is learning how to make chocolate chip cookies." but he burnt the first batch. Michael walked out of the kitchen, wearing a silly apron and wiping flour off his cheek. Hey, it was only a little burnt. They had character. Evelyn laughed, her eyes crinkling with a deep, radiant joy. She looked at Michael, and for the first time in 6 years, she felt completely, beautifully at home. 6 months had passed since that fateful day on the mountaintop. The autumn leaves had turned to deep shades of gold and red, falling gently onto the pristine lawns of the Seattle Children's Hospital. Today was the official ribbon-cutting ceremony for the David Miller Memorial Hangar, a state-of-the-art emergency flight facility funded by the Brooks Foundation. The hangar was named in honor of Michael's late co-pilot. The event was attended by hospital staff, city officials, and dozens of families who had already benefited from the Foundation's rapid transport program. Michael stood near the podium, looking exceptionally handsome in a dark gray suit. He looked relaxed, his shoulders no longer carrying the crushing weight of his past. Sophie stood beside him, wearing a bright yellow dress. In her hands, she carried a beautifully wrapped wooden box. Evelyn approached them, her emerald green gown flowing elegantly as she walked. She looked younger, her face peaceful and filled with a soft, approachable warmth. "You both look incredible," Evelyn smiled, her eyes lingering on Michael's face. "We had to dress up for the chairperson," Michael teased, his eyes warm with affection. Sophie stepped forward, holding up the box. "This is for you, Evelyn. You have to open it now, before the speeches start." Evelyn knelt down to Sophie's level. "For me? What is it?" She carefully untied the silk ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside was a beautifully hand-carved wooden helicopter. It was painted with exquisite detail, but instead of military markings, it had a small red heart painted on the side. Beneath the model lay a small handwritten card. The card read, "To Evelyn, thank you for landing in our lives. Love, Sophie." Evelyn felt a familiar tightness in her throat, but it was no longer the tightness of grief or guilt. It was the overwhelming, beautiful weight of love. She looked up at Michael, her eyes wet with tears. "Do you like it?" Sophie asked anxiously. "I love it, Sophie," Evelyn whispered, hugging the little girl tightly. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." Michael reached down, offering his hand to help Evelyn stand up. As she stood, he didn't let go. Their fingers intertwined, warm and secure. "Evelyn," Michael said softly, his voice carrying a deep sincerity. "6 months ago, you made a joke on that mountaintop. You said if I could fly that helicopter, you'd marry me." Evelyn's cheeks flushed pink. "Michael, I was being an arrogant fool. I didn't know." "I know," Michael smiled, his thumb gently tracing the back of her hand. "But sometimes, a wrong turn or a foolish joke opens the exact door we were supposed to walk through. I didn't just fly a helicopter that day, Evelyn. I flew back to life. And I found you." Evelyn looked into his warm, steady eyes. The cold walls of her tech empire had completely crumbled, replaced by the simple, beautiful warmth of a family. "I don't care about the helicopter anymore, Michael," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I just want to be wherever you and Sophie are." Michael smiled, pulling her close. "Then you're exactly where you belong." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the Seattle horizon, the three of them stood on the balcony of the hangar, looking out at the city lights. There were no boardrooms. There were no cold corporate contracts. There was only a father, a daughter, and a woman who had finally landed. Never judge a person by their cover. Never assume that the clothes they wear, the job they do, or the tools in their hands define their worth. The person you look down upon today might be the very hero who saves your life tomorrow. In the grand journey of life, success is not measured by how high you can fly. It is measured by the people you are willing to land for. And sometimes, the most beautiful destinations in our lives are reached through a door we opened by mistake.